The Matinee by William Abney. The woman walked at a steady pace between the hedgerows of the quiet lane that leads to Billington. It was a fine afternoon, an afternoon when the kind angle of the autumn sun seemed to have turned everything to gold. She had nearly 2 miles to go yet, but as the curtain didn't rise until 3 o'clock, there was plenty of time for her to enjoy the peace and gentleness of her surroundings. How odd, she thought to herself, that they should still be in Billington after all this time. The Walter Birch Players' summer season, June till the middle of October. That was longer than most, but Billington has a very mild climate, and people like to come there to catch the last of the sun's warm rays. Though she had been away for many years, the woman was well acquainted with the road she followed, and made little sounds of recognition as she came across each familiar feature on the way: a gate, a tree, the little cemetery, a cottage, that one, for instance. "Ugh!" she exclaimed, her face a little sour with disapproval. "They've painted it blue. Now why did they want to do that?" New people, she supposed, probably refugees from suburbia without feeling for the countryside. She reproved herself for being so intolerant, and had at least to acknowledge their good sense in having chosen to settle here, in her territory, for so she regarded it, although she was really a Londoner, and it was only through an endless succession of seasons with the Walter Birch Players that she had come to look upon this ground as home. Endless succession of seasons? Not altogether so. There had been an end, a rather abrupt end, some years ago. Just how many years she couldn't remember. 6, 7, maybe even 10. And life had never quite been the same since. She still missed that smell of size which seemed to be a chronic component of the backstage atmosphere of any weekly rep. Scenery, ever in a state of being prepared for the next show. At first she had found it quite revolting, like the acrid stench of bilious attacks over lavatory bowls as a child, but later it had come to mean more to her than any whiff of Lanvin or Chanel, and those chaotic rehearsals with dog-eared scripts, when all the proper moves had to be changed because of their crude and simple sets, and studying lines back at the digs into the small hours, the anguish of opening nights, words forgotten, entrances missed, yet the whole thing somehow accomplished and greeted when all was done by tumultuous applause. On all this she reflected with a warm, sad pleasure as she left the peaceful protection of her country lane and approached the outskirts of Billington. It was a small market town, 2 miles from the coast, and it offered the best of both worlds as a little centre for seaside and country holidays. The theatre was a ramshackle, gawky, Edwardian building, with wrought iron arches supporting a glass shelter over the forecourt. It stood on the fringe of the town, and having stalls, circle, and a gallery, reared up tall and narrow, its back now in view, scarred in a series of diagonals by an ugly metal fire escape. She stopped for a moment and gazed at the odd structure with affection, but despite the warmth of her feeling, she started to shiver. She had forgotten, for that moment, just how it had all ended, for her at any rate. But that was a long time ago, she told herself, and, shrugging off the chill, felt only the pleasure of seeing the old place again. Would any of her crowd be there, she wondered? The lady at the box office, what was her name? Hetty? Letty? Something like that. And dear Jim, the aging factotum, who never failed to don his well-worn, outsize uniform before taking up his position in the middle of the foyer. He couldn't still be there, surely. He'd be too old by now. There might still be some people in the company, though. One or two, perhaps. It had been like a family in a way, and people would always come back if they could possibly manage it. Would George be there? Not likely. Not after what had happened. Poor George. She'd never realized how involved he was, nor that he could be so jealous. But he was a good actor, and made a splendid Darky Bellingham. That, of course, was the incredible coincidence, that they should be playing, of all things, Love from a Stranger, that old chestnut. Her last show there, and, if public reaction were anything to go by, not such an old chestnut. We certainly kept them on the edge of their seats, she recalled, with some satisfaction. She looked at her watch, and realized that though she had allowed herself plenty of time for the walk, she had spent far too much of it daydreaming. It was now after 3, and the curtain would already be up. Quickening her pace, she cut through the car park, and finally reached the forecourt, where she would have liked to have paused and examined the cheaply printed bills and the sepia portraits of all the players, all displayed outside the glass and mahogany swing doors. But there was no time for that. The foyer looked empty. They had all gone in, she supposed. No sign of Jim. If by any chance he was still with them, he'd probably have slipped off for a quick brew-up. She hurried over to the box office. If Hetty or Letty, whichever it was still there, she'd give her a comp, of course. Not that it mattered, she was quite prepared to pay for her seat, but it would be nice, that feeling of mild importance. For a few seconds she waited by the window, but it seemed there was no one in the office. Midweek matinee, late in the season, yes, things would be pretty quiet, she reasoned. And anyhow, the business side of things had never exactly been a model of efficiency. Well, she wasn't going to waste any more time. If they weren't there to sell a ticket, she would just go in without one. She walked down the 5, rather threadbare, red-carpeted steps, and reached the horseshoe corridor, circumscribing the stalls. Choosing a small door halfway down the side, through which she knew she could slip quite unnoticed, she entered the dark auditorium and eased herself quietly into a back stall. It was rather incredible how everything seemed familiar still. She inhaled deeply and detected a hint of size even where she was sitting. Lovely. The country cottage set was still there with its roughly painted would-be Tudor beams, so like the other ones she remembered. Not quite as good, though, really. In her day, the standard had been surprisingly high, and the actors, they seemed familiar too. Well, of course, it is George. That was a comfort to know that he was back, that things hadn't gone too badly for him. And the other man, her faithful friend in the play, surely that was Robert Weston, looking older perhaps, but not much. This was more than she'd hoped for. She'd have to go round afterwards, just for old time's sake. What about the girl playing her part? She knew that she herself had been rather good in it, and she still remembered with satisfaction the gasp of the audience when, in an hysterical effort to escape Darky, she opened the back door and found herself face to face with him. It had frightened her too, particularly that last time, when George had been so peculiar. She watched the girl carefully, not wanting to be overcritical, but subconsciously hoping she wouldn't be too good. She was good, though, surprisingly good, and she had to admit it. But at least it was consoling to see that the part was being played in much the same way she would have played it herself, with dignity and breeding. It amused her when she considered her orphanage background to think that she'd always been cast to play ladies of breeding, never the Cockney maid or colonial hoyden, but always the Cynthias, the Penelopes, and the Angelas. She followed the action of the play loosely, one half of her mind almost repeating the well-remembered lines with the actors, the other half reflecting on what those lines evoked. The intervals came and the lights went up, but she didn't leave her seat. She looked around at the middle-aged patrons in the half-empty stalls to see if there might be a face she could recognize, one of the regulars, a shopkeeper maybe. Wednesday was early closing day. A few of them were familiar, and she smiled in a tentative way when they looked in her direction, in the hope that they might acknowledge her. That would have been nice. But they didn't, and she was too often left with a half-formed smile on her face and nowhere to dispose of it. After the final curtain had fallen, she waited until the house was empty and furtively made her way up to the past door. She wanted to surprise them, George and Robert, and Tommy, the stage manager too, if he was still there. She opened the door, climbed up the splintered wooden steps, and arrived in the prompt corner. The lights had been turned off, and she had to grope her way blindly round the braces and weights supporting the scenery before she could get backstage. At last, she reached the light of the stone passageway which led to the stage door and the dressing-room stairs. She paused for a moment, overwhelmed by a sense of sadness. She hadn't expected to feel sad. All afternoon she had been looking forward to this moment, to the fun of reunion, talking over old times, probably having tea with them between shows at the Tudor Café, egg and chips and fresh cream cakes. She walked to the edge of the passageway and was about to climb the stairs when suddenly there was an urgent call from the direction of the dressing rooms. "Tommy! Tommy, come quickly! It's George!" She recognized the voice of the girl whose performance she had so much admired. The desperate tone of the summons unnerved her, and she hovered anxiously, one foot poised on the bottom step, not knowing what to do. Within seconds, a burly figure, it was Tommy, emerged noisily from the basement, brushed past her as if she hadn't been there, and tore up the stone steps 2 at a time. Whatever was going on there, she had no wish to be involved. It reminded her too vividly of what had happened before. In fact, the sooner she could get away from it all, the better. She turned round and headed for the stage door, pulling it open and scurrying through in one distracted movement. Once outside, she stumbled along the path leading across the empty car park, anxious to put some distance between herself and the feeling of terror that the building now held for her. After what she felt was a safe interval, she stopped and looked round at the ugly rear aspect of the place. On one of the higher platforms of the fire escape, she saw George, standing close beside the door. Slowly, the door opened, hiding George from view as it swung back on its hinges. From the rectangular darkness of the open doorway, the actress stepped cautiously out onto the platform, looking up and down the flight of metal steps. From below, the woman watched the silent action as she had watched the play that afternoon, knowing in advance the course it would take. Sure enough, the door began to close again, and as it finally swung to, with a sharp clang, the girl turned and found herself facing George. Prepared for this, the woman below called out to them both in an effort to shatter the scene, but nothing happened. No sound would pass her lips, and all she heard in the afternoon stillness was a stifled gasp as George closed his hands around the throat of the girl above. Arms flailed about in wild, convulsive gestures that died slowly down until all movement stopped. George released his hold of the now limp figure, and, like an outsized puppet, it buckled at the knees, falling backwards over the edge of the platform and down to the asphalt below. The nightmare was over. Racked with a terrible pain, the woman turned and walked away from the town, from the once friendly theatre, scene of her former triumphs, from the sad reflection of memories held too long, and, as she reached the quiet country lane and felt the warmth of the trees and hedges about her, the pain dissolved, and she ceased to care about what had gone before. But the day had taken its toll, and she was tired. As the shadows grew longer, she gradually slackened her pace, knowing she would have to rest before very long. At last, she came to the cottage painted blue, and, tired as she was, she still disapproved of the sight. Then, just a little beyond the cemetery, where the leaves had gathered like soft gold blankets over the earthen beds. Here, she thought, why not here? Why not here? As good a place as any for a rest. And under a weeping beech, she found herself a hollow in the ground. There she lay down, and letting all consciousness quietly slip away, she waited for the leaves to cover her.